Welcome to Connecting with Your Inner Hero. If you found your way here, you might be seeking community of individuals who face trauma and are ready to find a safe place to learn, grow, and move from surviving to thriving. We're your hosts. I'm Lisa Johnson, certified holistic health practitioner, joined by Christina Lapari, certified life and health coach. Hi, I'm Lisa.
And I'm Christina.
Today we're talking about understanding what happened to you in regards to generational trauma. We're going to be talking about recognizing the impact on the listener's life and also giving you some tools for healing and breaking the cycle. So generational trauma is something that most people that have complex trauma have experienced in their lives.
Correctly. So when it comes to generational trauma, it definitely has a connection with the complex trauma that individuals tend to experience in their life. And the reason being is because it doesn't just start with them. If you look at the history of the individual that has complex trauma, generational trauma is something that follows them as well as through their family members. And generational trauma, if you look at the definition of it, is it's a psychological and emotional burden passed down through families due to unhealed trauma from previous generations. And one thing that you and I have been talking about a lot within our podcast is how CPTSD is something that we deal with in our daily lives as a trauma survivor. And truly for us, you and I, and hopefully for different listeners, it's really about what being a cycle breaker of generational trauma is.
Fair enough. And then providing those tools for healing and breaking that cycle is extremely important. So I'm grateful that you're going to be sharing that with us today. That being said, how is it then that generational trauma is transferred from, say, one family member to another?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I didn't really understand it until I started reading a couple different books. And there's so much out there in regards to generational trauma now than there was before. And when I started learning about generational trauma and the behaviors and how it was affecting my life, I really started talking to people about it because I'm like, listen, pay attention to your family tree. Start understanding why your childhood felt the way it did to you, but also look at your parents and understand their parents. And with generational trauma, when you really do sit down and write it down, like what your life looked like, then what your mother's life looked like, and then what her mother's life looked like, that's where you see that trauma ladder really projecting in all of your lives. And you can continue back as far as you know, in regards to behaviors from different individuals, but just the addiction in families. Like if you look at my family tree and you really say, okay, where's this transfer of behaviors? Where's this transfer of trauma? It's like for myself, like I was a cycle breaker of addiction when it came to my family. But my mom, my dad, both had addictive personalities.
I would say also addictive coping mechanisms as well. So then what they did was they taught you their coping mechanisms as opposed to teaching you how to be emotionally balanced because they didn't have that in their life. They could not teach that to you. So
right.
Instead what
behaviors.
They did was exactly. So then they just taught you their coping mechanisms. And so you learn from that. And then, so you would start with your own addictions because that's all you know how to do. But then at some point in your life, you became aware and you realized that you didn't need to behave that way anymore. So when we talk about recurring family patterns of addiction or of abuse or things like that, you're talking about identification in the family line. So how did you come about identifying that in your own family line?
I was expected to deal with the physical abuse, and I was expected not to have any emotions towards it. So as a child, immediately, I'm being conditioned to be compliant. I'm being conditioned to understand that this is just the way life is. But as I got older and started researching generational trauma is where I started thinking to myself, why did this person do what they did to me? I started asking questions. And then to me, it was exposed that there was other trauma from the parent of that individual. And then as I started asking more questions, I uncovered that there was more trauma from that side of family.
So it could be that they were being abused somehow. And then that's what they knew. So then that's how they live their lives, but they didn't stop and get curious about the why.
Correct.
I think that's the key is being mindful enough to ask the question, like, why is this even happening? Like,
Right.
There was something in you that knew to ask that.
Exactly. Well, and that's because I decided to start getting therapy at the age of 19. I decided to be the cycle breaker. If you look back at the generational trauma, they just knew this was the behavior that they were taught and they never received the help. And it was just, well, this is how we were shown love. So I guess this is how we show love. And that's the generational trauma pattern of abuse that just continued. It wasn't talked about. Nobody wanted to talk about it. And then as we got older, we did start talking about it here and there, but there was so much shame to it. And those individuals that happened to, besides just me, it was like they didn't want to be the cycle breakers. They just talked about it and stayed in the survivor mode. At least the ones that I know. There were ones that I didn't know. And so I think that's really where you try to recognize the impact of your life and recognize, okay, these are the behaviors that I was taught as a child. Because of these certain behaviors, I became a people pleaser. And the reason why I became a people pleaser was because I was trying to protect myself. And as a people pleaser, you go into your adult life and then you start recognizing, no, I don't have these abusive behavior patterns, but because of the trauma that happened to me as a child, I am now taking that trauma and putting it into a different category in my life, or I don't know if I want to say category, a different behavior in my life as a people pleaser.
Somehow mentally keep living out the same patterns, even though the specific situation isn't occurring anymore, but those are your survival patterns. So you keep replaying the patterns over and over because that's what your brain recognizes, like a well-worn trail. And somehow you got to get yourself off the trail.
Right, exactly. And your brain, it adapts to your circumstances. I'm going to continue to protect myself. So if I'm a people pleaser and I just make everybody happy around me, then I don't get hurt anymore.
Correct. But instead, what ends up happening is you're just trading away small bits of yourself.
Exactly.
But at the same time, you're also trying to get your needs met and trying to get those things fulfilled. And really what it is you've got this inner child that needs to heal. Yes. And you've got these patterns that you need to break. And then on top of it, then there's additional family dynamics that you're trying to unwind and deal with. There's society. There's all different types of interplay as an adult that you don't have as a child that now you're trying to navigate through. So can we talk a little bit about some of the triggers that you had to navigate through and how you were able to recognize them as triggers so you could start to work through those things?
So the type of work that the individual did had a very distinctive smell to it and a uniform. It was blue Dickies. Probably the best way to say it now. It was work pants. And so as I was older and was dating in life, I had a really hard time with certain smells. And I had a really hard time with blue Dickies. So ironically, I was dating an individual who wore blue Dickies for work. And I had to have a conversation with this individual and say, when you come home, I need you to take off your blue Dickies and change. And that individual understood because he knew what had happened to me as a child. And so he was okay with it. But, you don't want to go around and tell everybody, don't wear blue Dickies.
Yes, you can't wear blue Dickies or you can't. This is something I got to deal with here.
Yeah. And so I realized it was something that happened to me. It didn't have to define me. It didn't have to define my life of who I could and couldn't date. Right. And so obviously going through my trauma and going through therapy and just, with my faith and just praying about it, and because I realized it was a me thing, what I had to tell myself was, listen, this person is not the person who hurt you. This is a complete different individual that is wearing blue Dickies because they have to, and they don't understand that this is triggering you. So again, my behaviors changed because of how I was able to process it, how therapy was able to help me and so forth. So yeah, that is a great question because a lot of people don't realize that sound or smell or familiarity of that situation. And it's truly just understanding how trauma affects you.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And so that being said, you were able to be empowered to make that change within yourself, to heal that unconscious pattern that you had in your brain that connected those types of things to what you had experienced.
Right.
And so then you were able to work through that. So what do you think were some of the best tools and therapeutic interventions that you experienced to remove that from your system so then you could, deal with blue work pants?
So yeah, really the tools for healing and truly the breaking of the cycle is really what it came down to. Is I didn't want to pass this trauma on to my child. And so as I continued to understand what generational trauma was, I continued to go to therapy. And again, journaling, we've talked about that so much. Journaling helped me understand and process triggers. I think that's the biggest thing is, because we can't always be in the therapist's office, right? And you're going to be triggered, like the blue pants, right? So having, the therapy and then going to the different groups and then understanding how to process through triggers. So, as you're in therapy and they do different practice like EMDR and understanding how to remove yourself from that negative thought process, that trigger that's attacking you at that moment, sitting down and writing just, okay, this is what's going on. When you have that opportunity, taking it back to the therapist and saying, this is what happened. This is how I responded. And it was either negative or positive. I was able to take a breath. I was able to remove myself. And that's the biggest thing that I've learned is stop, process. We tend to respond to our triggers with emotion first because our brain immediately says, this is a trigger. This is how I feel. And then it was respond. And I did that a lot until I really understood this is a trigger. This is how I feel. Now stop. Process. Don't allow your emotions to respond. And I've noticed that not just with relationships, but also my work environment. That's for me has been key, truly, when it comes to just the healing of triggers from my past. But it took me a long time because as you go through trauma, it's really that self-sabotaging. You don't understand that you're doing it. And until you understand it, it affects your life. It influences a lot of your decisions. And so that's why I think it's so important for anybody who feels that generational trauma is something that they've gone through to really get the help.
So what would you say were the key behavioral patterns that you developed, and how were you able to work through them to heal those patterns in your life so that you weren't passing those things down to your own children?
Behaviors such as bad relationships, attaching myself onto somebody that didn't love me, attaching myself in a relationship that I was verbally being abused, opposed to physically being abused, attaching myself to someone that needed them to be fixed. So that people pleaser personality of mine. I just want to please this person. Codependency, and it's things as I look back, I'm like, okay, this relationship, I was codependent. This relationship, I was being verbally abused. This relationship, the person felt like a dad opposed to a boyfriend. Because
so you're
for
constantly
me,
trying to heal that father wound, basically. Now, what about working through that intergenerational healing part? Like, is it possible to heal the family system itself? Is it necessary? Is it sometimes something that you walk away from? Like, what did that look like for you?
That's a tough one. Biggest thing is boundaries, really creating the boundaries around individuals that have hurt you in the past, individuals that are continuing to hurt you, and maybe they don't realize it. And communication. Communication's hard when you don't know how to talk to that individual that's been abusive towards you. And sometimes the boundary is you just cut off the communication. And that's what my counselor had taught me is we're going to forgive that person, but it triggers you to have any conversation with that person. So you just need to remove yourself from the environment anytime that individual is going to be there. It's about you. It's about your own healing. It's about what happened to you and making sure that doesn't progress in your life. Yes, as a believer, like I truly believe in forgiveness. I believe in open communication. I believe in saying, you know what, you hurt me. But sometimes it's you give that to God and you give that to your therapist, and that's how you reconcile with that individual. And then you move on.
Yeah.
I think that's key.
I think it's really important for us to create a sense of safety within ourselves by honoring that child, that inner child that's within ourselves, to say, I'm the adult now. And we weren't protected when we were younger, but we are going to take the steps now to create that safety and to create that protective space for ourselves at this point. And that actually builds that internal trust, and it starts to build that internal resilience that we need in order to be able to break these generational patterns.
Exactly. And I think truly when it comes to healing the generational patterns, trauma, triggers, it's really about self-compassion. Understanding what happened to you doesn't have to create a pattern in your life that you continue. It doesn't have to make it where it becomes you. You get to restart. You get to be the cycle breaker. You get to bring that healthy legacy into your life, into your family, into your future. Because I think that's the biggest thing is there's not enough cycle breakers out there because we've learned how to be a survivor. We just haven't learned how to move forward and be the thriver and that cycle breaker in our family, and to show this doesn't have to happen. We don't have to be silent. We don't have to allow what happened in our past to dictate our future.
That's very true. And it does. It takes time. Thank you very much for sharing your story with us today. I think it's super important to remember that healing takes time, and with the right steps, you can really heal generational trauma. And that way, moving forward, your children's generations can be much healthier. And it's just one step at a time.
I agree. Personal growth is key for sure.
As we close out this episode, we hope you found valuable insights. We have more for you, though. Grab your free journal that goes along with the podcast episodes. The link is in the show notes.
Let us know in the comments what part of the episode resonated with you the most. Don't forget to follow and hit the notification bell to get updates on our newest episodes. Until then, be brighter and remember, healing is always within reach.